Melanie was pacing anxiously, unable to calm her nerves. The wedding dress felt suffocating, not because of its weight, but because of the growing uncertainty in her heart. Where was Adrian? The ceremony was only 15 minutes away, and the groom was nowhere to be seen. Outside, guests gathered near the registry office, murmuring among themselves. Melanie's friends, weary from standing in their high heels and waiting, were eager to snap pictures and post updates on Instagram. The photographers, just as nervous as Melanie, kept asking if everything was all right. Time ticked by, but Adrian still hadn't shown up. The bride's mother finally broke the silence, her frustration evident. Just then, a rusty old Buick pulled up in front of the registry office, catching everyone's attention. A young man stepped out, dressed in a simple suit, holding a modest bouquet of 3 chrysanthemums. Behind him emerged a group of people, slightly younger than Melanie's parents, wearing outdated attire that looked like it belonged in another era. Without hesitation, they climbed the stairs toward the crowd.
Wow.
Is this a vintage-themed wedding? Someone in the crowd joked, their curiosity piqued. Adrian approached Melanie, handed her the bouquet, and smiled apologetically.
Darling.
Sorry I'm late. The crowd fell silent, waiting to see how the scene would unfold. Melanie, bewildered, demanded an explanation. Adrian, what's going on? Is this some kind of surprise? Adrian's face was calm, but his voice carried a hint of vulnerability. Melanie, this isn't a surprise. It's the truth. I fell in love with you so deeply that I couldn't bring myself to tell you earlier. I'm not rich. My parents are ordinary workers, and I'm just a taxi driver who dreams of being your husband. Melanie's face flushed with anger. What kind of joke is this, Adrian? Is this some kind of prank or a hidden camera show? Do you think I'd marry someone pretending to be poor for fun? Adrian shook his head, his tone turning serious. This isn't a joke, Melanie. Just yesterday, you told me you loved me and wanted to spend your life with me. Has that changed so quickly? Melanie's frustration boiled over. Stop this nonsense, Adrian. What kind of spectacle are you trying to pull here? You've humiliated me in front of everyone. How could I have been so blind not to see you were a fraud? Adrian sighed, his voice steady but firm. There's no circus here. Remember when we were on that boat ride and you told me you'd live with me no matter what? Or the time at the cafe when I gave you that expensive watch? I bought all of that with my hard-earned money. I even took out a loan to give you the wedding you wanted. Hearing this, Melanie's emotions overwhelmed her. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to process what Adrian had said. She thought she had found a wealthy and considerate partner who could provide a secure future. In her dreams of a perfect life, she had even allowed her studies to suffer, thinking she wouldn't need to work after graduation. Adrian's stylish clothes, luxurious car, and upscale apartment had convinced her that he was well off. But now, the reality was unraveling before her eyes. The happiest day of her life had turned into her worst nightmare. Melanie didn't think she had stumbled upon a fairy tale romance. Everything Adrian had done seemed entirely normal to her. Coming from a wealthy family and being attractive, she believed it was only natural to choose a partner who matched her lifestyle. But now, everything felt like a cruel betrayal. Adrian tried to reach out to Melanie, but she pushed him away, her voice shaking with anger. How could you humiliate me like this? Embarrass me in front of all my relatives on the most important day of my life? There won't be any wedding, she declared. Turning away from the guests, Melanie stormed off. Her devastated parents and the crowd of friends and relatives stood frozen in shock, unsure how to react. A friend of the bride discreetly pulled out her phone to record the unfolding drama. The tension in the air was palpable. After all, it's not every day you witness such a spectacle. Melanie's father, Nicholas, was the first to break the silence. Melanie, come back. Couples have disagreements, it's normal, he called out, his voice tinged with desperation. But Melanie, her tears flowing freely, ignored her father and hurried down the sidewalk. Her mother, Vanessa, rushed after her, while Nicholas sank onto the steps of the registry office, his head in his hands. All eyes now turned to Adrian, who remained calm despite the chaos. With quiet determination, Adrian handed the modest bouquet of chrysanthemums to his parents before sitting down next to Nicholas. "How are you going to explain this?" Nicholas demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the guests. He looked Adrian straight in the eyes, his frustration evident. Adrian took a deep breath. "Nicholas, you've worked hard your entire life to give Melanie the best of everything, and I admire that. But there's something missing here: honesty and selflessness." Nicholas frowned, his anger bubbling over. "What are you even talking about? My daughter is an honest woman. You're the one who lied to her, taking her to fancy restaurants and driving her around in expensive cars you couldn't afford. Why didn't you tell her the truth? If she loved you, it wouldn't have mattered. You could have built a future together. Why did you deceive us? Are you nothing more than a con artist?" Adrian shook his head. "Your daughter's honesty isn't in question. But the moment she learned the truth about my financial situation, she ran away. I'm not a criminal, a drunkard, or a gambler. I work hard and earn an honest living. No, it's not much, but it's enough to build a life with someone who truly loves me. But today I've seen with my own eyes that Melanie doesn't love me. She loves the life she thought I could provide. She cares about appearances, about status, but not about me." The guests stood in stunned silence as Adrian spoke. His words were raw and filled with conviction, but they left everyone more confused. Melanie's friends whispered among themselves, struggling to piece together the story. Had Adrian really been living a lie all along? How could someone who had showered Melanie with gifts and taken her to high-end venues suddenly reveal such a humble reality? The entire situation felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. No one moved from the square near the registry office, their unease palpable. It was as if they were waiting for something, though none could articulate what that might be. Adrian finally stood up, ready to leave, when Melanie's aunt, a striking figure in a vibrant dress, stepped in his way. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded, her voice rising. "You think you can disgrace my niece like this and walk away? If you truly loved her, how could you have let this happen? Look around. So many guests, so much effort, and now this humiliation." Adrian's patience was wearing thin. "Why don't you ask your beloved niece Melanie why she refused to marry a simple, hard-working man? No money, no marriage, isn't that it?" His voice carried a mix of frustration and bitterness. "Is it a crime for a woman to want a better life?" The aunt shot back, her indignation sharp. "What about when children come? Should she live on scraps during maternity leave? That's not greed. It's called being practical. Did you deceive her? Or was she pretending to be someone she's not?" Adrian opened his mouth to retort but hesitated, words failing him. Before he could respond, his mother, Caitlin, stepped forward. Her calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the heated exchange. "Adrian didn't want to humiliate Melanie," Caitlin began, her voice steady but resolute. "He loved her deeply, so deeply that he overlooked what we discovered. But Melanie's actions made this inevitable." The aunt's fiery stance didn't waver. "What nonsense! It's always the daughter-in-law who's at fault, isn't it? Mothers always think their sons are angels." But Caitlin wasn't backing down. "A month ago, we saw Melanie at a cafe with another man." Her words silenced the crowd. Even Nicholas, Melanie's father, froze, stunned by this unexpected revelation. "We were sitting with friends," Caitlin continued, "and Melanie didn't notice us. She was talking to this man, telling him how much she loved him. She said she was only marrying Adrian for his money. We didn't want to believe it, but how could we keep this from our son?" The guests were stunned, their murmurs fading into a heavy silence. Adrian looked uneasy, avoiding eye contact as his mother spoke. He lightly touched Caitlin's elbow, trying to lead her away. "Come on, Mum. Let's go." But Caitlin wasn't finished. "Adrian didn't speak to us for a week after we told him. Then he said he'd still marry her. We urged him to test her intentions, to see if she truly loved him. That's why he decided to reveal his true financial situation today. And what happened? She ran, proof that she never loved him. All she wanted was money." Adrian gently but firmly guided his mother toward their car. That's enough, Mum. Let's go. The guests, still processing what they'd heard, began to drift away. Melanie's father, Nicholas, stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of disbelief and sorrow. How could I have raised such a daughter? He muttered, his voice hollow. He wandered aimlessly, unable to comprehend the collapse of what he had envisioned as a bright future for Melanie. His family's reassurances fell on deaf ears. Nicholas, who had doted on his daughter and dreamed of her happiness, was left grappling with the ruins of those hopes. Everything he thought he knew had crumbled in an instant. Vanessa sighed deeply, leaning against the doorframe. Melanie, it's not about what's more important. I've just been stretched so thin. I'm glad you've graduated, but we have bigger problems to face right now. Melanie turned away, clutching her phone tightly.
No one cares about me. Not you, not Dad.
Everyone just blames me for everything. Vanessa's expression softened, though fatigue lingered in her voice. We've never blamed you, Melanie, but it's time for you to step up and help. Your father needs care. The store is struggling.
And I
can't do this alone. Melanie looked up, her defenses momentarily dropping. What do you expect me to do? I don't know anything about running a store. And Dad's condition. I don't know how to handle that either. You could start by trying, Vanessa replied firmly. We don't need perfection, Melanie. Just effort. For a moment, the room was silent. Melanie stared at the floor, a battle waging inside her between resentment and guilt. Finally, she stood and grabbed her bag.
Fine.
I'll get the groceries, she muttered, brushing past her mother. As Melanie walked to the market, memories of her once perfect life flooded her mind. She had been the center of attention, adored by friends and admired for her charm.
Now,
she was just another person struggling to make sense of it all. The whispers of her classmates still echoed in her mind, cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. At the store, Melanie bumped into a former friend, Cassie. For a brief moment, she thought about striking up a conversation, hoping to rekindle some semblance of her old life. But Cassie barely acknowledged her, offering only a tight smile before walking away. Melanie returned home with the groceries and placed them on the counter without a word. Vanessa, who had been sitting by Nicholas's bedside, looked up. Thank you, she said quietly. Melanie hesitated before responding. Do you think things will ever go back to how they were? Vanessa's eyes softened, though they brimmed with unshed tears.
No.
Melanie, but maybe, just maybe, they'll become something better if we work together. For the first time in months, Melanie felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. Maybe, just maybe her family could rebuild. But the path to redemption was still unclear, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to walk it. Vanessa's face tightened with controlled emotion as she absorbed Melanie's words. Taking a deep breath, she responded with measured calm. Melanie, your father and I didn't work tirelessly because we wanted a glamorous life. We did it to give you the best opportunities. But somewhere along the way, we failed to teach you what really matters. What matters? Living paycheck to paycheck like you and Dad? Is that what you want for me? Melanie shot back, folding her arms. No, Melanie, Vanessa said firmly. What matters is integrity, kindness, and treating people with respect. Those things are worth more than any amount of money. Melanie rolled her eyes. That sounds nice, Mom, but it doesn't pay the bills. Vanessa's tone sharpened. Money didn't make Adrian love you, and it didn't make you happy. It also won't erase the pain you caused your father. All the wealth in the world couldn't buy you the character that's needed to build a life worth living. Melanie's face flushed with anger and humiliation. Why are you blaming me for everything? Adrian lied to me. He pretended to be someone he wasn't. Maybe he thought you'd only see his value if he presented himself a certain way, Vanessa countered. And after the way you reacted, can you blame him for thinking that? You humiliated him in front of everyone, Melanie. What did that accomplish? It showed him I won't be fooled, Melanie snapped. Vanessa shook her head sadly. No. It showed him exactly what kind of person you are, or at least who you've become. I hope, for your sake, you can take a good, hard look at yourself and decide if this is the person you want to be." Melanie's defiance faltered. For the first time, her mother's words seemed to cut through her stubborn shield. But she quickly recovered, brushing off Vanessa's criticism. "I'm going to my room," Melanie announced, grabbing her phone and storming off. Vanessa watched her go, her heart heavy. She knew Melanie's road to self-discovery would be long and painful, but she hoped her daughter would one day realize the truth. Wealth might bring comfort, but it couldn't replace the value of genuine relationships and a good heart. The reality of her situation was starting to sink in for Melanie. She stood amidst the neatly arranged racks of men's shirts and sweaters, feeling utterly out of place. "Melanie, what are you doing back here?" Rebecca's voice startled her, bringing her back to the present. I was just looking around," Melanie stammered, trying to mask her discomfort. Rebecca smiled kindly. "Don't worry. Everyone feels overwhelmed at first. Why don't you start by learning how to arrange the shelves? It's a good way to get familiar with the stock." Reluctantly, Melanie nodded and followed Rebecca's instructions. She carefully folded and stacked the clothes, but her mind kept drifting. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was beneath her. Yet a tiny voice in her head reminded her that her mother was right. This was her reality now. Vanessa approached Melanie a while later, observing her daughter's work. "How are you managing?" she asked. "It's fine," Melanie replied tersely, avoiding eye contact. "Good. Keep it up. I'll be in the office handling inventory orders. Rebecca, let me know if you need anything," Vanessa said before leaving them. Rebecca turned to Melanie. "Let me show you how to greet customers next. It's all about making them feel welcome." Melanie sighed inwardly, but followed Rebecca to the front of the store. As customers began to trickle in, Melanie stood stiffly behind the counter, unsure of how to interact with them. A middle-aged man approached with a sweater in hand. "Excuse me, do you have this in a larger size?" he asked politely. Melanie froze, unsure of what to say. Rebecca quickly stepped in. "Of course. Sir, let me check for you. Melanie, could you grab the size chart from the counter over there?" As Melanie retrieved the chart, she realized how little she knew about even the simplest tasks in the store. She felt humiliated but also determined not to let Rebecca down. Over the next few days, Melanie began to adjust, albeit reluctantly. She learned how to fold clothes properly, organize displays, and assist customers with basic inquiries. It was tedious work, but she couldn't deny the sense of accomplishment she felt when a customer left satisfied. One evening, as they closed up the shop, Rebecca patted Melanie on the shoulder. "You're getting the hang of it. It's not easy work, but you're doing well." Melanie managed a small smile. "Thanks. I'm just trying to get through it," Rebecca chuckled. "That's all any of us can do. But who knows? You might even find something you enjoy about this job." Melanie doubted it, but she kept the thought to herself. For now, she was focused on one thing: proving to her mother that she could handle this, even if it wasn't the life she had imagined. Melanie listened intently to Greta, captivated by her enthusiasm and deep understanding of their work. For the first time, she saw the store and its customers in a new light. "I never thought of it that way," Melanie admitted. "I always thought sales were just about convincing someone to buy something, not actually helping them." Greta smiled. "It's about both. When we genuinely care about the customers and help them find something that makes them happy, they trust us and keep coming back. That's how your parents built such a loyal clientele." Vanessa, who had been listening quietly from nearby, chimed in. "Greta's right. It's not just about selling clothes. It's about building relationships. People come here because they know we'll treat them with respect and help them look their best." Melanie nodded slowly, her mind racing. She'd always dismissed her parents' work as mundane and uninspiring, but now she was starting to understand the depth of their efforts. As the day went on, Melanie threw herself into learning the ropes. Greta and Rebecca patiently taught her how to assist customers, handle inventory, and even recommend outfit combinations. Though the work was tiring, Melanie found herself enjoying the challenge. For the first time in a long while, She felt a sense of purpose. The next morning, Melanie approached her mother with a determined expression.
Mom,
I want to learn more about this business. I know I've never shown interest before, but I think it's time I take responsibility and help out. Vanessa looked at her daughter with a mix of surprise and pride. I'm glad to hear that, Melanie. It won't be easy, but if you're serious, I'll teach you everything I know. Over the following weeks, Melanie immersed herself in the store's operations. She studied the latest fashion trends, learned about different fabrics and cuts, and even started experimenting with creating window displays. Customers began to notice her enthusiasm, and her confidence grew with each interaction. One day, a regular customer approached Melanie with a warm smile. You must be Vanessa's daughter. I can tell by the way you treat people. It's just like your mother. The compliment made Melanie's heart swell with pride. For the first time, she felt like she was truly a part of her parents' legacy. As the store began to thrive again, Melanie realized something profound. Success wasn't just about money or prestige. It was about hard work, integrity, and the connections you made along the way. And in that realization, she found a sense of fulfillment she never thought possible. Good morning, Melanie greeted warmly, stepping forward. How can we help you today? The elderly woman smiled kindly, adjusting her glasses. I've been hearing wonderful things about the store, and I decided to stop by. My grandson's wedding is in a few weeks, and I'd like to find something elegant to wear. I'm not as young as I used to be, but I want to look stylish and appropriate for the occasion. Melanie's face lit up. Of course. We have some lovely options that I think you'll adore.
Greta,
Could you help me pull a few pieces from the new collection? Greta nodded and disappeared into the racks, while Melanie struck up a conversation with the woman. What kind of colors do you like? And do you have a particular style in mind? I prefer darker shades, maybe navy or deep green. Something timeless, not too flashy, the woman replied. As Greta returned with a selection of dresses, Melanie helped the woman into the fitting room and began offering styling tips. This dress has a lovely drape that's both flattering and elegant. Pairing it with a delicate brooch and matching shoes will complete the look beautifully. The elderly woman stepped out in one of the dresses, and Greta clapped her hands in delight. You look absolutely stunning. The woman beamed, her reflection in the mirror radiating confidence. Oh, this is perfect. You girls are wonderful. By the time she left, the woman had not only purchased a dress, but also a matching scarf and handbag. She hugged Melanie and Greta on her way out. Thank you both so much. You've made me feel young again. As the door closed behind her, Greta turned to Melanie. You were incredible with her. She looked so happy. Melanie smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't experienced before. I think I'm starting to get the hang of this. It's not just about selling clothes. It's about making people feel good about themselves. Vanessa arrived at the store later that afternoon and heard about the customer's visit. She pulled Melanie aside and said, I'm so proud of you. You've grown so much these past months. Not just as my daughter, but as a person. I couldn't have asked for a better partner in this business. Melanie felt a lump rise in her throat but managed to smile. Thanks, Mom. I still have a lot to learn, but I'm glad I can finally be someone you're proud of. Vanessa hugged her daughter tightly. You've always been my daughter, and I've always loved you.
but now,
I see you truly becoming your own person, and that makes me the happiest mother in the world. As the weeks passed, Melanie continued to excel at the store, earning the trust and respect of customers and employees alike. For the first time in years, the family business began to thrive again. Melanie found herself looking forward to each day, not just for the work, but for the chance to connect with people and make a difference in their lives. And in the quiet moments, as she reflected on how far she had come, Melanie realized that the challenges she had faced, her failed marriage, her father's illness, the financial struggles, had all shaped her into a stronger, wiser version of herself. Life had thrown her into the deep end, but she had learned to swim, and now she was ready to face whatever came next with confidence and grace. Melanie sniffled and nodded, composing herself. She quickly rang up the purchase, carefully folded the pink dress, and handed it to the elderly woman with a trembling smile. "Thank you for your kindness," Melanie said softly. The woman gently patted Melanie's hand. "Let's step outside for some fresh air. You'll feel better talking it out." Greta gave Melanie an encouraging look as they walked toward the door. Once outside, the elderly woman guided Melanie to a nearby bench under the shade of a tree. She placed her shopping bag beside her and looked at Melanie with warmth and understanding. "Now, dear, tell me everything. It's easier to bear a burden when you share it," the woman urged. Melanie hesitated for a moment, unsure where to begin. Finally, she took a deep breath and started recounting the story of her failed wedding, the glamorous plans, the shocking revelations, and the moment Adrian confessed the truth about his humble life. "I was so focused on the life I thought I wanted, the wealth, the luxury, that I didn't see the person Adrian truly was. When he revealed everything on our wedding day, I felt humiliated. Like my perfect world had crumbled," Melanie admitted, her voice shaky. The elderly woman listened attentively, her eyes never leaving Melanie's tear-streaked face. "And now," she asked gently, "how do you feel about it all?" "I've realized how selfish I was," Melanie admitted, her voice filled with regret. "Adrian was honest and kind, and I only saw what I wanted to see. And now, my family is struggling, my father's health, the store, everything, and I feel like it's all my fault." The woman reached out and held Melanie's hand tightly. "It's never too late to change, dear. You're already taking steps to make amends by helping your family and working hard. And as for Adrian, well, life has a funny way of giving second chances." Melanie's eyes widened slightly at the woman's words. "You think so?" The woman smiled knowingly. "I know so. My grandson, Adrian, is much like his father, strong and resilient. If your paths cross again, don't let pride or fear hold you back. Sometimes, the simplest lives are the most fulfilling." Melanie stared at the woman, her heart skipping a beat. "Adrian? Your grandson is Adrian?" The woman nodded with a kind smile. "Yes, my dear. And I believe he still cares for you, even if things didn't work out the first time." Melanie's mind raced with memories and emotions. She felt a strange mix of hope and anxiety bubbling inside her. "Thank you for listening," Melanie finally said, her voice steadier now. "And thank you for your advice. It means a lot." The woman patted Melanie's hand again before standing up. "Remember, dear, life is full of surprises. Be open to them." As the elderly woman walked away, Melanie sat on the bench, her thoughts swirling. Could she face Adrian again? Could she make things right? She wasn't sure, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope shining through her regret. The next morning, Melanie arrived at the store earlier than usual, her mind racing with anticipation and questions about what Mrs. Sullivan wanted to discuss. She couldn't shake the feeling that their conversation might lead to something significant. As the clock struck 9, Mrs. Sullivan walked in, dressed elegantly in a pastel suit. She greeted Melanie warmly, carrying a small leather-bound notebook in her hand. "Good morning, dear," Mrs. Sullivan began with a smile. "I see you were eager to meet me today." "Good morning," Melanie replied, her nerves barely hidden. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting." "Well, I thought a lot about what you said," Mrs. Sullivan said, her tone kind but firm. "And I decided it's time for some truths to come to light. But before we get to that, I want to ask you something. If life gave you a chance to make things right, would you take it?" Melanie's breath caught in her throat. I don't know. I've made so many mistakes. But yes, I'd try. I'd want to fix what I've broken, if it's even possible." Mrs. Sullivan nodded approvingly. "Good. Now, let me share something with you. After our conversation yesterday, I spoke to Adrian." Melanie's heart skipped a beat. You told him about me?" "Yes," Mrs. Sullivan admitted. "I told him everything you said. About your father's condition, about how you've been helping your family, and about how you're working hard to rebuild yourself." He listened, Melanie. He listened very carefully. Melanie was at a loss for words. Her emotions swirled between hope and fear. Adrian has been through a lot too, Mrs. Sullivan continued. He's been trying to move on, but his heart still holds a place for you. The question is, are you ready to have an honest conversation with him? To admit your faults and listen to his perspective? Melanie's eyes welled up with tears. I don't know if he'll forgive me, but I'd like the chance to try. I owe him that much. Mrs. Sullivan reached out and patted Melanie's hand. Then let's not waste time. Adrian is waiting for us at the cafe. The same one where this whole misunderstanding began. Melanie's pulse quickened as they left the store together. The walk to the cafe felt like a blur. By the time they arrived, Melanie spotted Adrian sitting by the window, a cup of coffee in his hands. He looked up and met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Go on, dear, Mrs. Sullivan encouraged. This is your moment. Melanie took a deep breath and walked over to Adrian's table. Hi, Adrian, she said softly. Can we talk? Adrian gestured to the seat across from him. I'm listening. Melanie sat down and began to speak, her voice trembling but sincere. She told him everything, her regrets, her realizations, and her hopes to make amends. Adrian listened silently, his face thoughtful. When she finished, he leaned back and let out a long sigh. Melanie, he began, I won't lie. What happened that day hurt me deeply. But hearing what you've been through and seeing how much you've grown, it means something. It shows me you're not the same person you were. Melanie's heart soared with a glimmer of hope. Does that mean you might forgive me? Adrian smiled faintly. Forgiveness is a process, Melanie. But I'm willing to try. Maybe we can start by getting to know each other again, this time without any lies or expectations. Melanie nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'd like that, Adrian. I'd like that very much. As they sat together, talking and laughing like old friends, Mrs. Sullivan watched from a distance, a satisfied smile on her face. Sometimes, she thought, life really does give second chances to those who are brave enough to take them. Mrs. Sullivan gave her son a patient smile. Brandon, you can eat at this cafe. I want to visit. It's called Just Pizza. I've heard they have delicious food at reasonable prices. Brandon groaned. Mom, are you serious? That place is crowded with students. Why don't we go somewhere quieter? Brandon, Mrs. Sullivan said firmly. Sometimes it's good to step out of your comfort zone. You might even enjoy it. Reluctantly, Brandon drove her to Just Pizza. The place was bustling with energy, filled with young people chatting and laughing over slices of pizza and cups of coffee. Mrs. Sullivan's eyes lit up as she scanned the lively atmosphere. This is exactly what I needed, she said. Stepping inside, Brandon followed her, clearly out of place among the younger crowd. They found a small table near the window, and Mrs. Sullivan ordered a classic margarita pizza and a cappuccino. Brandon settled for an espresso, still frowning. As they waited for their order, Mrs. Sullivan observed the cafe's clientele. Her attention was soon drawn to a familiar face. It was Melanie, sitting alone at a corner table, sipping a coffee and flipping through a notebook. Brandon, isn't that Adrian's ex-fiancé? Mrs. Sullivan asked, nodding toward Melanie. Brandon turned to look. Yes, it is. What's she doing here? I'm going to find out, Mrs. Sullivan said decisively. She rose from her seat and approached Melanie. Melanie, dear. Mrs. Sullivan greeted warmly. What a pleasant surprise. Melanie looked up, startled. Mrs. Sullivan, I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't expect to see you either, but here we are, Mrs. Sullivan said, taking the seat across from her. How have you been? Melanie hesitated, then replied, I've been busy, working at my parents' store and trying to help out where I can. Mrs. Sullivan studied her thoughtfully. You seem to have grown a lot in these past months, Melanie. I'm proud of you. Melanie's eyes widened in surprise. Proud? Of me? After everything that happened? Yes, Mrs. Sullivan said firmly. You've taken responsibility for your mistakes and worked hard to support your family. That takes courage. Brandon, who had been watching from their table, finally joined them. He looked at Melanie awkwardly.
Melanie.
Hi, Brandon, she replied politely. Mrs. Sullivan leaned in conspiratorially. Melanie, I have a question for you. Do you still think about Adrian? Melanie flushed.
I
I don't know. It's complicated. It doesn't have to be, Mrs. Sullivan said gently. Adrian may be stubborn, but he still cares for you. I see it in his eyes. He's making a mistake marrying someone he doesn't love. And you're still holding on to feelings for him, aren't you? Melanie looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe. But it's too late. He's engaged, and I don't want to cause any more pain. Brandon spoke up, his tone serious. If you still have feelings for him, you should tell him, Melanie. Adrian deserves to know the truth before it's too late. Mrs. Sullivan nodded in agreement. Brandon is right. Don't let pride or fear hold you back. Go to him, Melanie. Melanie hesitated, her heart pounding. Could she really face Adrian again? Could she undo the damage caused by their disastrous wedding day? Taking a deep breath, Melanie finally said, Okay, I'll talk to him. Mrs. Sullivan smiled, her eyes twinkling with hope. Good girl. Now let's finish our meal and make a plan. Mrs. Sullivan watched Brandon walk away, shaking her head. The conversation only deepened her concern. She could see her son's world unraveling, but his pride and Caitlin's influence blinded him to the reality of their situation. As she sat on the bench, Mrs. Sullivan mulled over everything she had learned about Melanie, Adrian, and her family. Her heart ached for Adrian, trapped in a life he clearly didn't want, and for Melanie, who had been misjudged and humiliated. Mrs. Sullivan decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts, finally landing on Adrian's number. She hesitated for a moment before pressing call. Grandma? Adrian answered, his voice weary. Adrian, we need to talk. Can you come over this evening? She asked, keeping her tone calm but firm. I'm swamped with work, Grandma. What's this about? Adrian replied, sounding distracted. It's about your wedding, Adrian, and your future. Please come, she said with a sense of finality. There was a pause on the line before Adrian sighed. All right, Grandma. I'll be there. That evening, as the sun set, Adrian arrived at Mrs. Sullivan's apartment. She welcomed him warmly and motioned for him to sit in the cozy living room. Grandma, I'm not sure what this is about, but I really don't have much time, Adrian said, glancing at his watch. Adrian, you always have time to fix a mistake, Mrs. Sullivan began, her voice steady. I know about Crystal and the circumstances of this engagement. I also know you don't love her. Adrian stiffened. Grandma, it's complicated. The marriage is more about family obligations than love. Mrs. Sullivan leaned forward, her expression serious. And what about Melanie? Do you still have feelings for her? Adrian hesitated, his eyes betraying his emotions. I don't know. Maybe. But she ran away from the wedding. She didn't want me once she knew I wasn't wealthy. Did she, Adrian? Or did you put her in a situation that anyone would struggle to navigate? Love requires trust, and you tested her in the cruelest way, Mrs. Sullivan said sharply. Have you even tried to talk to her since that day? Adrian looked away, guilt etched on his face. No, I haven't. Then it's time you do, Mrs. Sullivan said firmly. I spoke with Melanie. She explained everything to me. She still cares about you, Adrian. But she's been through a lot. Her father's stroke, her family's financial struggles, she's changed. And she's taken responsibility for her life. Adrian's expression softened as he listened. She said that? Yes, and I believe her. You owe it to yourself and to her to have an honest conversation. Don't let pride or outside pressures dictate your life, Mrs. Sullivan urged. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. I'll think about it, Grandma, he said quietly. Don't just think, Adrian.
do something.
Before it's too late, Mrs. Sullivan said, her voice filled with determination. Adrian nodded, lost in thought. He left shortly after, but Mrs. Sullivan knew she had planted a seed. Whether it would grow or not was now up to him. As she cleaned up the teacups, Mrs. Sullivan smiled to herself. Sometimes, even the most tangled threads can be woven into something beautiful, she whispered. As Adrian caught up with Melanie outside the cafe, she turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. The city lights reflected in her eyes, making her look both heartbroken and resolute. Adrian hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. But then he took a deep breath and stepped closer. "Melanie, I don't even know where to begin," Adrian said, his voice filled with regret. "I should have stood up for you. I should have trusted you. But instead, I let my insecurities and my mother's manipulations get the better of me." Melanie crossed her arms, trying to compose herself. "Adrian, you humiliated me in front of everyone I cared about. You didn't even ask me what really happened. You just assumed the worst. Do you know how much that hurt?" "I know," Adrian replied, his voice cracking. "I was a fool. I let my doubts and the pressure from my family cloud my judgment. I let you down when you needed me most. But, Melanie, seeing you again today, hearing everything. I can't lose you. I love you." Melanie shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Love? Adrian, love is built on trust. You didn't trust me then. How can I be sure you won't doubt me again in the future?" Adrian stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "Because I've learned my lesson. My grandmother, she's the one who helped me see how wrong I was. She believes in us, Melanie. And I promise from now on, I'll be the man you deserve. Just give me a chance to prove it." Melanie hesitated. Her heart ached with lingering love for Adrian, but the pain of the past was still fresh. She studied his face, searching for sincerity. "This isn't something we can fix overnight, Adrian. If we try again, it'll take time to rebuild trust and understand each other." Adrian nodded earnestly. "I'll wait as long as it takes. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me there's still hope." Melanie sighed, a small, tentative smile breaking through her tears. "There's hope, Adrian. But we'll take it slow. No more secrets, no more games." Adrian smiled back, relief washing over him. "No more games. I promise. Just honesty and us trying to be better for each other." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past lifting just slightly. Then Adrian extended his hand. "Can I walk you home?" Melanie hesitated, then nodded, slipping her hand into his. Together, they walked into the night, ready to take the first steps toward rebuilding what they had lost. Back in the cafe, the tension at the table was palpable. Caitlin sat in stunned silence, her usual confidence replaced by guilt and unease. Brandon turned to his mother, his voice low but firm. "Mom, thank you for exposing this. I was too blinded to see the truth, but now I understand. I need to fix things with Adrian, with Melanie, and with myself." Mrs. Sullivan placed a reassuring hand on her son's shoulder. "You've made mistakes, Brandon, but recognizing them is the first step. Now focus on supporting your son and repairing your family." Caitlin finally broke her silence, her voice trembling. "Brandon, I didn't mean for things to go this far. I was trying to secure Adrian's future, to ensure he married someone who would benefit our family." Brandon shook his head in disbelief. "At what cost, Caitlin? You nearly destroyed our son's happiness and our marriage. I don't know if I can forgive this." Mrs. Sullivan stood, her voice cutting through the tension. "Caitlin, manipulation never leads to real happiness. You've hurt everyone here, including yourself. It's time to reflect on your actions and make amends." Caitlin nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll try," she whispered. As the family left the cafe, the air was heavy with unresolved emotions, but also a sense of hope. Adrian and Melanie had taken the first steps toward healing, and Mrs. Sullivan's unwavering wisdom had reminded them all of the importance of truth, love, and trust.